The sun dipped low over the sprawling hills, casting long shadows over the dry, cracked earth. In this vast wilderness, untouched by human hands, there was one creature who ruled the land, the wild horse. Her coat, a deep chestnut brown, shimmered under the fading light as she moved through the tall grass, her every step purposeful, her eyes constantly darting, wary of any movement. She had lived in this rugged terrain for years, untouched by humans, a ghost in the wild. For her, trust was a foreign concept. Her world was shaped by the sharp, constant need to survive, and she had no room for anyone who might get in her way. But one man was different. The rancher had heard whispers about her, the wild mare that no one could tame. Some said she was impossible to catch, that no one could get close enough to even try. Yet, something about her intrigued him. He wasn't like the others. He had spent years in the company of horses, but never one as untamed as her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the defiance, the strength, and he was determined to earn her trust. It wasn't a challenge, it was a calling. And so, day after day, he followed the horse's trail, watched her from afar, and waited. The rancher didn't rush. He knew better than to force a bond where none existed. But as the days stretched on, a subtle shift began. The horse, though wary, didn't run. And for the first time, the rancher felt something shift in the air, hope. Something told him that, one day, the wild mare would let him close. But how close and when? That, only time would reveal. Before she became a myth whispered about around campfires and at local saloons, the wild horse was once like any other. Her name, long lost to time, had been spoken by the ranchers who had once tried to tame her, but now, she was simply known as the mare. She had been born in a quiet valley, far from the prying eyes of humans, in a herd that roamed freely across the wide plains. Her mother, a strong and cautious mare, had taught her the ways of the wild, how to find water in the driest of seasons, how to navigate the jagged cliffs, and most importantly, how to avoid the ever-present threat of men. As a foal, she was full of wonder, her bright eyes taking in the beauty and danger of the world around her. She would follow her mother through the rolling hills, her small hooves kicking up dust as the wind whipped through her mane. But as she grew, she learned the true cost of freedom. It wasn't the harsh winters or the summer droughts that threatened her the most, it was the humans. One fateful day, when she was no longer a foal but a young mare, she had witnessed a band of riders approaching her herd. The humans were cruel, their movements sharp and unkind. They came with ropes, nets, and traps, hoping to break the spirit of the wild horses and sell them to the highest bidder. The mare's mother had fought with all her strength, kicking and bucking as the riders circled them. But in the chaos, she had been captured, and the mare, frightened and confused, had watched as her mother was taken away. That was the last time the mare had seen humans up close, and it was the day her trust in them shattered completely. The memories of the sounds, the clanging metal, the shouting men, the panic of her mother's desperate struggle were burned into her mind. From that moment, she swore to never allow another human near her. She fled deep into the mountains, far from the ranches, where the scent of man could not reach. 4 years, she lived alone, growing older and wiser, but always with that shadow of fear trailing her every step. The wild horse had learned how to survive, but it had cost her something far more precious, her belief in the possibility of kindness. And so she wandered, a solitary creature, her spirit untamed, forever haunted by the past. The first time the rancher saw the wild mare, she was little more than a fleeting shadow in the distance, galloping across the horizon as if the earth itself could not hold her. He had heard the stories, of course the tales spun by old-timers and whispered by the few brave souls who had tried and failed to capture her. "She's untamable," they said. "A ghost in the hills. Better leave her be." But the rancher wasn't like the others. He knew the value of patience. He knew that some things were worth waiting for. Every morning, for days on end, he arrived at the same spot, a high ridge overlooking the valley where the mare was often seen. His horses were left behind, their reins slack in the dirt, as he climbed alone to the quiet, solitary place where he could watch without disturbing her. The rancher would settle into the soft earth, waiting, watching. He wasn't there to chase or force his way into her world. He was there to understand her, to let her come to him in her own time. He didn't carry weapons, didn't even bring a rope. His only tool was patience, a skill honed by years of working with animals that didn't trust easily. But the wild horse wasn't like any animal he'd encountered. She was intelligent, sharp-eyed, and far more elusive than any herd he'd worked with. There was something in her that called to him a spirit he understood, a kind of untamed pride he knew could only be earned, never taken. On his first few attempts, the mare barely spared him a glance. She would appear at the edge of the valley, grazing or drinking, and then, sensing his presence, she would bolt swift as a lightning strike, disappearing into the trees before he could even take a full breath. She was fast. Too fast to be caught, at least by the methods of others. Yet, each time she fled, the rancher felt no frustration, only an unspoken understanding. She wasn't ready. But one day she would be. And so, the routine continued. The rancher came every day at dawn, finding his place on the ridge or beside the stream, never advancing beyond the boundary of her comfort zone. Over the course of the weeks, he learned the mare's rhythms when she grazed, when she drank, when she rested. He began to recognize the little signs of her curiosity, the slight flicker of her ears when she heard him, the cautious way she would peer through the underbrush, always staying at a distance but never fleeing as quickly as before. He didn't try to get closer. Not yet. That wasn't the point. The point was to show her that he was no threat, that his presence was nothing to fear. And slowly, imperceptibly, the wild mare began to adjust. She no longer sprinted at the sight of him. She lingered a little longer at the water's edge before moving away. He didn't speak to her at first, but as the days passed, he began to murmur quietly, his voice low and soothing, hoping she could hear the calm in it. It was a long process, one that seemed to stretch on endlessly with no signs of progress. But then, one morning, something shifted. She stayed. The rancher watched, his breath held in quiet anticipation. The mare stood still, her wild eyes watching him intently from a distance. She hadn't run. She hadn't moved away. And for the first time, the rancher allowed himself to believe that there might be a way forward after all. As the days turned into weeks, the rancher's quiet presence began to weave its subtle thread into the mare's world. The first sign of change was barely noticeable, a shift so small it could have been mistaken for coincidence, yet it was enough to stir a quiet hope in the rancher's chest. One morning, as the sun broke over the distant peaks, the mare lingered near the ridge where he sat, watching him through the brush. She didn't run. She didn't retreat to the hills. She simply stood there, her dark eyes fixed on him as if considering whether he was worth the effort of flight. The rancher's heart raced, but he kept his body still, his breathing steady. He understood now that patience wasn't just a passive waiting, it was an active practice, a quiet invitation to the mare to make the first move. Every small moment was a step toward something more. On the days that followed, he continued his ritual. Each time, he chose a new spot, different angles of observation, giving the mare a sense of control, a sense that she was never cornered, never trapped. His movements remained slow and deliberate. He sat with his back to her, never staring directly, never reaching out. Instead, he allowed the breeze to carry his scent, his presence, into the air between them. And slowly, she began to soften. The mare began to stay longer at the water's edge, sometimes even grazing near where the rancher sat, though always at a distance. She would take cautious steps toward him, but there was always hesitation, a quick flick of her ears as if to remind herself that he was still a potential threat. At times, when the rancher sat very still, she would approach just within a few yards, her hooves barely making a sound on the ground. The rancher never moved when she did this. Instead, he allowed the silence to build, an unspoken language between them. There were no harsh commands, no loud noises, just the soft rhythm of the wind, the quiet murmur of the distant stream, and the faint sound of the mare's breath. This was not a battle of wills. This was a slow dance of trust, a delicate push and pull that neither could rush. One afternoon, when the sun was high and the air thick with heat, the mare did something unexpected. She lowered her head, her long neck stretched low to the ground as she grazed, her muzzle just within a few feet of where the rancher sat. The movement was deliberate, cautious, but it was a gesture of trust. She had allowed him into her space, her territory, without the usual tension that came with his presence. For a brief moment, she seemed to forget her fear, as if the rancher had become just another part of the landscape she had learned to navigate. The rancher held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. His hand, still resting on the ground beside him, remained unmoving, the muscles in his arm taut with the effort to remain still. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the walls between them began to crumble. He didn't dare reach out. Not yet. Instead, he whispered to her, a soft, steady murmur of words she couldn't understand, but that somehow felt like a promise. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to be with you." For a fleeting instant, he believed she understood. The mare's eyes met his, and for a heartbeat, everything stilled, man and horse, caught in a suspended moment of mutual recognition. And then, as quickly as it had come, the connection broke, and the mare lifted her head, stepping back with a cautious yet graceful retreat into the shadows of the trees. But she didn't run far. She didn't flee. She stayed just out of reach, watching him once again. And this time, he knew, she was learning to trust. It was a crisp autumn morning when the breakthrough finally came. The rancher had been following his usual routine for weeks, sitting in silence, watching the mare from a distance, and offering nothing but his quiet presence. He had learned to be patient, to wait for the mare to decide when she was ready. There were no more hurried steps, no more anxious glances, just the steady rhythm of trust building between them, slowly, imperceptibly. That day, the air felt different, almost electric, with the promise of something significant. The rancher had arrived at his usual spot by the ridge before dawn, just as the first hints of light began to touch the sky. He knew the mare's pattern well by now. She would be grazing near the stream, just beyond the tree line, her dark figure barely visible against the rising mist. But something tugged at him that morning, a feeling that today might be the day when everything would change. He settled into his spot as usual, his back to the rising sun, and allowed himself to relax into the stillness. His heart was calm, his movements deliberate and slow, though his senses were heightened, acutely aware of every rustle in the leaves, every shift of the wind. He could feel the presence of the mare long before she appeared, the subtle change in the landscape when she stepped out from behind the trees. For a long while, she stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes scanning the land, then flicking toward him. Her gaze held steady, as if measuring his resolve. The rancher did not move. His muscles ached from the stillness, but he resisted the urge to shift. He knew now that any sudden movement would break the fragile trust they had built together. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she took a single step forward. And then another. Each movement was tentative, measured, as if she was still unsure whether this was the moment to approach or retreat. But she kept coming. Slowly, cautiously, she moved toward him, her hooves barely making a sound on the ground. The rancher's breath caught in his chest. He kept his eyes on the mare, but didn't stare directly at her. His hands remained by his side, the fingers twitching ever so slightly with the urge to reach out, to close the distance between them. But he resisted. This was her decision. Finally, she was close enough for him to feel the heat of her body, the faint rustling of her mane in the wind. She stopped just a few feet away, her nose twitching as she inhaled his scent. Her eyes were wide, alert, but there was no fear now, only a quiet curiosity. The rancher could feel her muscles tense, a brief flicker of hesitation passing through her, but then she exhaled softly, as if releasing the last remnants of doubt. This was it. The moment of truth. The rancher slowly extended his hand, palm up, towards her. He kept his movements as slow and non-threatening as possible, his gaze soft and steady. It felt like an eternity passed before she finally made the decision to trust him. The mare's nose twitched again, and then, with surprising gentleness, she nudged his hand with her muzzle. The rancher's heart soared. In that moment, all the weeks of waiting, all the patience and silent communication, had come to fruition. He had broken through the invisible barrier that had kept them apart for so long. He didn't move to pet her or make any sudden gestures. Instead, he let his hand rest there, feeling the warmth of her touch. He whispered softly, his voice barely audible above the breeze, "I knew you'd come." And for the first time, the wild horse allowed him to be close, truly close, without fear, without hesitation. It was a moment of quiet triumph, not a victory won by force or speed, but by the simple, powerful act of trust. And with it came the realization that their journey had only just begun. From that moment on, the wild horse was no longer the elusive creature that had once roamed alone. The bond between her and the rancher grew stronger with each passing day, but it wasn't just the mare who had changed, it was both of them. Where there had been wariness, now there was quiet understanding. The mare began to approach the rancher willingly, her steps lighter, her gaze softer. She no longer bolted at his presence. Instead, she sought him out, standing close but never too close, as though savoring the newfound sense of safety in his company. The rancher, for his part, respected her boundaries, allowing her the space she needed to feel in control of the situation. Over time, the transformation became even more visible. She would stand beside him as he worked, her dark eyes watching him with a sense of calm that had once seemed impossible. No longer afraid, she began to follow his movements, learning to trust him completely. The once wild mare, who had been shaped by fear and solitude, now stood as a companion, her strength no longer in her solitary survival, but in the quiet bond she shared with the rancher. Together, they had bridged the gap between fear and friendship. The transformation of the wild horse was nothing short of miraculous. What began as a dance of distance and distrust had blossomed into a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. The rancher had never sought to tame her. He had only wished to stand by her, to earn her trust in a world where it had once been lost. As the days turned into months, their bond deepened. The mare, once a creature of fear and solitude, now stood beside him willingly, her head low in quiet trust. And though she would always carry the wildness in her heart, there was no longer a need to escape, to flee from the safety that had once seemed so foreign. The rancher reflected on their journey, how patience, compassion, and respect had been the true keys to unlocking the mare's heart. In return, she had taught him something profound, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in conquering what seems untamable, but in learning to wait, to listen, and to simply be present. Together, the rancher and the wild horse had forged a new path not of mastery, but of harmony, a friendship that would endure as long as the land itself.